So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Professor Keith Fox. Keith is our current director of the Faraday Institute, and he's also a professor of biochemistry at the University of Southampton. As well as that, he's a licensed lay minister in the Church of England, a former chairman and trustee of Christians in Science, and he's editor of the journal Science and Christian Belief. Keith originally studied natural sciences in Cambridge, specialising in biochemistry, followed by a PhD in the Department of Pharmacology. He then held a research fellowship at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, before moving to Southampton as a lecturer in 1987, and he's been a professor there since 2000. His research interests concern DNA structure and recognition, and his scientific work has been published in over 200 articles. He's also the senior executive editor of the key journal in his field, which is nucleic acids research. And I think as he comes to talk to us about bioethics, it will be somewhat from the point of view of DNA and genetics. So welcome, Keith.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for your welcome. Thank you, everybody, for coming back to this. Let me start sharing my slides so that we can see if the technology works. I hope you can see that. Nobody's screaming at me to say no, so I'll assume that's a yes. Thank you for your introduction. As Sarah said, I'm a mere biochemist. I am not a theologian or a philosopher or a bioethicist even, but I've had some interest in the whole area of bioethics for a number of years. And what I want to do this afternoon is to talk you through very quickly a number of issues, give you a little bit of chance to talk together about some of the things as well, just to highlight some of the problems and the things that our science, the questions our science throws up. I think we need to be aware, though, at the start of not appearing to be overly negative. We've seen this and heard it in lots of the other presentations, that science actually has enabled us to see great things about how wonderful the world is and how it's God's gift to us that enables us to explore the way in which he's made such an amazing world. And the fact that it works and it's amenable to scientific examination is itself fascinating. And actually, science itself is often ethically neutral. We're just finding out about the way the world works. It's finding truth about nature, about the way that God has made things. But the application of some of our scientific discoveries is not ethically neutral, and it throws up all sorts of questions. As Sarah said, I'm a biochemist. I've spent most of my life researching this wonderful molecule over the right-hand side of your screens, DNA. So quite a bit of what I will say will be focused on that, although not exclusively, I hope. So it's an area of bioethics, and you might wonder, well, what is bioethics? But it's any ethical question that biological advances throw up. And here's just a few examples on the screen there, taken from a couple of ethical websites. And you can see they cover things ranging from the human genome and the things that we know about that to how we deal with genetics, not just human genetics, but animal genetics and plant genetics, to do with our health. And you can see vaccination is one that comes down there. There's the whole question that we've already talked about in other presentations of environmental ethics. There's the way that we treat animals. All of these are really, but they all raise questions. So where are we going today? So I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about how we make ethical decisions. Those of you who had training in ethics will find this a very cursory view across that. Because we can't avoid it, I want to talk a little bit about issues related to COVID vaccination, because there are some things that Christians raise. And then to look at some things about DNA and our sequencing and the sorts of things that we can do for fun and the sorts of things that we can do to get real information about ourselves. We'll look at stem cells and embryos very briefly, and then look at some of the new things that are coming online, things like gene correction, gene modification, and enhancements. Some of those at the end may seem a little bit like science fiction, but I think the pace at which science advances is such that we've got to be careful about science fiction, because what is fiction today quite very easily becomes fact tomorrow. And many of the things that we can do now could not have been dreamt about even 10 years ago. We should also be aware that not everybody approves of bioethics, of actually asking ethical questions. He's Steven Pinker, a psychologist, a linguist, a popular science writer, writing a few years ago in the Boston Globe, says the best thing that bioethicists can do is to get out the way. Don't talk about principles such as dignity or sacredness or social justice. Just let science get on with it and it'll sort itself out eventually. I think that's a rather depressing view of how we should treat ethics. On the other hand, we also need to make sure that we avoid fake news and that we actually get the science right. And this is probably a well-known quote from Augustine, talking about the ways in which some Christians can, in very well-meaning ways, talk nonsense about a subject that they understand nothing about. So we should take all means, he says, to prevent such an embarrassing situation in which people show up a vast ignorance in a Christian and laugh it to scorn. So one of our duties as Christians before we start talking about the ethics is to make sure we've got the science right, is actually to know what we're talking about. Otherwise, we can sometimes appear, even though we're well-meaning, appear to be rather foolish. So let's spend a little bit of time thinking, how do we make ethical decisions? Beware, I should say at the start, what I will call the yuck factor or the wow factor. There are some things that just seem disgusting and that we shouldn't do it. Many years ago, when the first heart transplants were performed, people went to say, that's just horrible. How could you possibly walk around with somebody else's heart in you? And it's not a routine thing now, but it's much more common and people don't ask that sort of question. So beware the yuck factor. There are plenty of things that we submit ourselves to that are undignified. If you go to a doctor, some of the things that they will do and the places they will poke are not particularly dignifying, but they're essential. The yuck is not necessarily an argument. Similarly, the wow is not an argument either. There are some things you think, wow, that's just fascinating. I wonder what would happen if. Wow is also not an ethical argument. So how do we make ethical decisions? Well, one is just rule-based ethics, if you like, the 10 Commandments, deontological ethics, if you like. What is my duty? What am I commanded to do? What does the law say? You've got to actually then ask the question as to where does the law come from? Of course, with the 10 Commandments, it comes from God, but the scriptures don't give us answers directly to many of the questions that we would ask that are thrown up by current day biology. And Paul, writing in 2 Corinthians, says the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. You know, the law itself can be very constraining. And actually, human nature is such that our tendency is to say, what can I get away with? Where's the loophole in the law? And I think we see that currently in a lot of the reactions to COVID restrictions. Can I just sneak past a little bit, do a little bit? And sometimes laws collide with each other. You shall not lie, but sometimes you have to lie in order to be able to preserve somebody's life. Laws can be confused with rights. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as it says in the US Constitution. Rules themselves are very helpful. They're not wrong, but they're often not sufficient for making ethical decisions. So sometimes we make a decision by what are the consequences of the decision, if you like, a utilitarian approach. It focuses on the consequences that any action that we take might have, and we balance the positive with the negative outcomes. So Jesus said, when he was accused by the Pharisees of breaking the Sabbath law, of saying, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill life? What are the consequences of what you do? There's a sort of utilitarian approach that sometimes comes into bioethics, and Dave Buchlas mentioned it in passing in his previous talk. Some of our approach to care for the environment is utilitarian. How can it help us as a sort of anthropocentric view of the world? how useful can this be? There's a view that says, well, we should make ethical decisions on what we might call natural law. What is going to promote human flourishing? What's going to give the greatest happiest for the greatest number of people? But what does that say about minorities? When Jesus tells us to leave the 99 and go after the one, to look after the poor and the vulnerable, those who are weaker in society. I think the ethical principle that probably resonates most with Christians is that would be virtue-based ethics, an ethical decision that's based on character. So I'm not asking the question, what should I do? But what sort of person should I be as I do it? How can I use my ethical decisions to show love and joy and peace and patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control? Those are the things that should motivate us as Christians. Of course, we could take general ethical principles, and some of these are taken from the way that medics decide things, that we should be doing good and we shouldn't do harm, although sometimes you have to go through something painful in order to be able to do good. That there is in our ethical decisions a form of autonomy. People have the right to decide for themselves. And there has to be justice. We treat all people equally. So, and we're in the pandemic. Vaccination is the question of the moment. There are anti-vaxxers out there. I say, don't even dare to think about this. They should be banned, in my view, from Twitter, from Facebook, from all the social media. It's based on fake news. But there are some questions, some genuine questions that some Christians ask. And one is over the source of the vaccine. And they're quite right, is that let me get it right, it's the AstraZeneca vaccine is the one, as many vaccines are, that is prepared and cultured through what's called HEC293 cells. That's human embryonic kidney cells. They were derived back in 1973 from an aborted fetus. So there is the question out there, should we be using that vaccine that's come through an abortion? A couple of responses to that. Firstly, of course, the abortion didn't take place in order to generate those cells. If you like, we're redeeming a situation that we would have regretted. Those cells have been used in biochemistry and cell biology labs for many, many years. They're extremely good at expressing proteins. And it illustrates, if you like, a way in which ethically a number of good things have resulted from things that we would regret that are awful. How many medical practices, especially for dealing with trauma, do we know more about because of the things that went on in concentration camps in the Second World War? To my mind, that the source of the vaccine, much though it might be regretted that HEC cells came from an aborted fetus, I don't think that's sufficient reason for saying that we should not use those cells. It's got nothing to do with the abortion debate now. There are, of course, risks in anything. Nothing is risk-free, and plenty of research has been done into that vaccine to minimize any risk. Of course, things do sometimes go wrong, but we have to, if you like, compare the risk of vaccination with the risk of not vaccination, and those outweigh each other by several orders of magnitude. And then there are questions, of course, as to who should be vaccinated. The vaccine might be limited. Should we use it to reduce, to maximize the health benefits, to treat the elderly? Should we reduce the burden on the NHS, save as many lives as possible, maximize the years of life saved? Saving a 90-year-old gives fewer extra years than saving a 30-year-old, although the chance of a 30-year-old dying from COVID is much lower. And so who should we prioritize? And these are difficult decisions for which there are no simple answers. And sometimes it's politics and economics that does that. So here's this DNA molecule that I've been researching various aspects of it for years. Instantly recognizable by all sorts of people, whether they've got a scientific background or not. It's become a bit of an icon of the age. And actually over the bottom right here, you can even buy DNA perfume. At least it comes in a helical bottle, and you can buy it for him or for her. For those who don't have a scientific background, let me just give you a little bit, back up a little bit to talk about what a gene might be. A gene is a region of DNA that codes for a protein. It's a very simple explanation. We could get it a lot more complicated than this if we want. It's between 1,000 and 100,000, or maybe 1,000,000 of these bases, that's A, G, C, and T that repeated long. And each of our chromosomes has many of these genes lined up on them. That's probably a bad illustration there, because actually the gaps between the genes are much bigger than the size of the genes themselves often. We have 23 different chromosomes in humans, each contain, so in total we have about 20,000, a little bit more than that, genes distributed between those 3 billion, that's 3,000 million base pairs of those letters A, G, C, and T. And every cell in your body contains exactly the same DNA. It's different in precise sequence from anybody else's, but every one of your cells contains the same DNA, and that different ones of those genes are activated in different tissues. One of the greatest achievements, I think, in science over the past 20 years has been the sequencing of the human genome. Starting in about 2000, when the first draft of that was published, and then various revisions of that since. We do know a lot about the human genome, but what do we do with that knowledge? I wonder if you've had your DNA tested. I'd be interested later to find out how many of you might have gone to something like Ancestry.com or 23andMe and sent samples of cheek cells off for them so to come back and give you your genome profile. Some people use it because they're interested in their ancestry. Where might it have come from? They might be interested in their health. They might just do it for fun. Here was their publicity just over a year ago. Give a DNA testing kit as a gift. There's your Christmas present to your family, a DNA testing kit. Beware of that. There are examples out there where a father has given that a testing kit to his family, only to discover afterwards that there were skeletons in the cupboard that were probably best left there, and that the parenthood of the children wasn't exactly what had already been thought. The sins of the past are sometimes best left not re-explored. Not all of these companies are equally rigorous. This is one that one of my researchers came across, which tells you your eureka, your BAM, and your zoom. In other words, how fast you are, how intelligent you are, and how strong you are. It's actually a bit of a con, because they actually test 3 genes, I think, in the whole thing. And if you read their small print, it's be clear that this is not a substitute for professional medical judgment. Consult your doctor if you've got any real questions. But what would you do? Why would you want to have your genome sequenced? Would it be to identify any form of disease risk that you might have, or that you might pass on to your children, that might change your lifestyle or change your diet in order to avoid a disease? Maybe it's just that you're curious. It'd be fun to know. What about your ancestry? So you can find some things about, where do I come from? Where in the world do my ancestors originate from, based on the sequence? And if you got it, would you understand the result? Let me give you a few examples of maybe not understanding the result, or rather showing how complicated it is. Alzheimer's disease has some genetic component. It's poorly understood, but we know that one of the genes that has an involvement in Alzheimer's is this thing called the ApoE gene. Everybody has 2 copies of that, and it comes in a variety of different forms: ApoE2, ApoE3, and ApoE4. And it's the ApoE4 one, which is present in about 10 to 15% of people, that increases the risk, and I emphasize it's the risk, not the certainty, of getting Alzheimer's in the lower age of onset. But these are probabilities, and they affect the risks of suffering, not the certainty. Would you want to know what your ApoE4 status is? I was in a conference of geneticists many years ago when somebody announced that they had a biochemical test that could test people's genomes as to whether they were ApoE4, whether they had that or not, and offered it for free to anybody there in the conference, and nobody took it. Would you want to know something for which there is no cure? You can't act on that in order to be able to affect your lack of Alzheimer's. Here's an example too of lack of understanding from somebody who will give credit to supposed to be intelligent, acting in the best of faith, I think. You may remember this was over a year ago, Matt Hancock, who was the health secretary, announced he'd been tested for prostate cancer as part of his genome testing, and the results showed he had a 15% risk of developing prostate cancer. And he said, the truth is this test may have saved my life. Except when you look at the statistics of it, is actually 15% is lower than the national average for men, as according to Cancer Research UK. And this geneticist from University College London says that the claim that the test may have saved his life is frankly ridiculous. It demonstrates an astonishing and wondering degree of innumeracy and lack of comprehension. Now, I don't say that in order to make a dig at Matt Hancock. It's just to show that what do you do with the data that you're given? And do we really understand it, unless a genetic counselor talks us through with it. So you could do that. You have some form of indication of your susceptibility to disease. You can have genetic counseling. It can be used for prenatal screening, and it can be used for, if you like, personalized medicines. Which medicines are you going to have a bad reaction to? But when you've had your genome sequenced, unfortunately, you can't unknow something. So when your insurer asks you, have you ever had your genome sequenced? Have you submitted to a DNA test? You cannot say no if you have had. And once you know, who else should you tell? Should you tell your family, your parents who gave you those genes in the first place? Should you tell your children who might have inherited it? Should you tell your GP, your insurer, your employer? If the genome says that you're at risk of a heart disease, maybe they want to have less of an investment in your future because they might not get quite so many years out of you. The genetic diagnosis, some of that can be postnatal once the child is born. It's very helpful to know what diseases they may encounter later in life. You can then take changes in lifestyle, in diet. There is prenatal diagnosis. We'll talk a little bit about that, where we can screen embryos and only implant these so-called healthy ones. That's pre-implantation. But there's also the possibility of doing DNA screening on the growing fetus. And of course, the implication of that isn't just to prepare the parents for what the child will be like, but often the implication is that if the child isn't going to be so, say, perfect, that an abortion might be the option. And I think many of us would be very cautious of that. It does raise questions then about when life begins and what it means to be human. It can be used very powerfully to avoid certain diseases. Tay-Sachs disease is a genetic disease that's particularly prominent amongst the Ashkenazi Jews, and thalassemia amongst Greek Cypriots. There are various programs where people can get tested for those, and then in the knowledge of whether they're a carrier for those genes can be used for helping them to choose whether they are going to have children or not, or whether actually a relationship should continue. So there are some positive things for that, but are we getting close to what I might call genetic discrimination, of actually saying there are some people with some diseases that we would rather were not born amongst from us? So there's a fine line between identifying the disease and being with the person who suffers from the genetic disease. In fact, in many conditions, it's not simply one gene, one condition. For a lot of things, there are many genes that interact together to get an effect. There's not so much, if you hear in the newspaper there's a gene for, then usually ignore that article, because there is no such thing as a gene for obesity, a gene for violence, a gene for. Most genes combine together to get an effect. James Watson of the Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA, got it in a lot of trouble, and was actually sacked from his job at Cold Spring Harbor because he said that he was inherently gloomy about the prospect for Africa, because, as he put it, all our social policies are based on the fact that their intelligence is the same as ours, where all the testing says not really. I mean, that is absolute nonsense, but you can see some of the ways in which these sorts of things can be misused. There are many, many genetic markers that affect intelligence in tiny ways. And a far better way to improve intelligence is actually to have a good education. Similarly, diabetes or height, there are many, many genes that work together. So we could be, if you like, accused of what I might call genetic reductionism, that we begin to think we're nothing more than the sum of our genes. With these, so it's in our DNA, sort of fallacy. But the thing about the genetic code, it's universal. So the same DNA coding works in bacteria, in plants and animals, and in humans. So we could transfer genes from one species to another one, and they work. The coding is exactly the same. So it leads us to genetic modification. And a number of people raise questions about this. Are we playing at God in being able to shuffle genes around? It asks questions about what is natural. It asks about risk. It asks about questions between boundaries, between species. But again, beware of inflammatory words. Frankenfood, transgenics, mutation, actually a lot of those are loaded words. Even the phrase genetic engineering rather sounds like quality control, predictable outcomes, quantifiable standards and measurement. It sounds very cold and calculated. And the phrase three-parent embryos is one that we'll come back to in a moment. Actually, it's not three parents. We'll explain what that means in a moment. So beware of using inflammatory language. The whole question of whether we're playing at God suggests that there are boundaries that we shouldn't cross. It also suggests that scientists are playing. All of my colleagues, I don't think they are playing. I think they're being deadly serious in the science that they're doing, usually trying to benefit mankind as well as to be able to explore the world. We're made in the image of God. Does that mean, as God is creator, that we too should be created? And after all, healing, restoration, feeding of the poor, they're all part of Christian duties. And over the centuries, Christians have been at the leading edge of those sorts of ways of aiding society, the hospital movement, the dealing with those who are starving. Raise the question, what is natural? Here's a lovely lakeland scene. You might think that's a natural view. Of course it isn't. That's a man-made view. Without our cultivating of that, without our management of it, it wouldn't look like that at all. We might talk about foods, what is natural. This is probably what primitive popcorn looked like. The one on the left is probably the one that was around several thousand years ago, from which over various selections, we eventually get to something like today's popcorn. But this is more like the sort of corn that on a bad harvest my wife gets in our garden. Not particularly wonderful to look at. What is natural? We've selected things over the years. In fact, many economically useful varieties are not natural. We've either selected them, or even worse, we've selected them back in the 1940s and 50s by inducing mutations, actually by irradiating them randomly and scattering the seed and seeing which ones actually were the most productive. Now, of course, the genetic modifications that we can do are much more focused than that. They're not random. They're after putting specific things in specific places. So why would we do genetic modification? Well, to increase food production, to feed the world. We may do it for medical reasons, for research, for curiosity, maybe for ego, or for commercial reasons. And there's nothing wrong with commerce. When you go to your local grocer's store, your supermarket, they're not feeding you or selling things to you just because they love you. They're doing so because they want to make money. And we ask questions about, is GM safe? Is it natural? Is it fair? Is it needed? I said some of it's for fun. We might question this. Here is Alba the bunny, where the artist Eduardo Keck worked alongside a molecular biologist to produce a rabbit which had green fluorescent protein within all of its cells. The rabbit seemed to be reasonably healthy, but there was no medical benefit to it. It was done as an art form. You might be able to buy glowfish. These are those of you who keep tropical fish. These were originally designed with the thought that they could be used for testing for water pollution, that their color might change in polluted water. Now, actually, they're used only as an aquarium novelty. Their website used to say about the ethical principles that they had in generating those fish, about safety, humane treatment, and following the technology. I went to their website yesterday and I could not find those statements anymore. They've got a much greater variety of fish that you can buy. So GM applications, you can use it in agriculture for crops. Golden rice is an example. So it has vitamin, the gene for making vitamin A inserted into that. So that places which suffer from vitamin A deficiency, this golden rice can supplement that. We can have crops that are drought resistant or resistant to pesticides. That increase the nutritional yield, they increase the resilience of the crop, increase the yields. Many of our pharmaceuticals come from genetic modification. Insulin used to be extracted from pig pancreas. Now, of course, it's nearly all made by genetic modification and grown in bacteria. Growth hormones, Herceptin, the drug for treating breast cancer, is a GM product. Interferon for dealing with some viral diseases. ZMapp, which was the antibody that was used for treating Ebola, was made in transgenic tobacco plants. So there are many useful applications of it. The challenge is, can we feed the world's population? It says that we need to have almost a doubling of the world's food output by 2050. And can the science of GM help in there? We need to ask the question, will it benefit the poor, or will it only just put more cash and more into the hands of those who are rich anyway? Francis Collins was mentioned earlier, I think yesterday, as director of the National Institute of Health in the USA, a wonderful Christian scientist. And he puts it this way: to say that genetic engineering is unacceptable across the board because of its potential for creating some ethical dilemmas is the most unethical stance of all. It's basically to say, here's a powerful approach which could alleviate human suffering, but we're not going to do it because we're worried about the misuses that might occur. I find that, he says, completely unacceptable from every point of view. So I'm going to stop there for a few moments and suggest we break into some groups. I'm going to ask you and your groups to discuss these two things. Would you have your DNA profile analyzed by 23andMe or Ancestry.com? Maybe some of you already have. If you haven't, then what would your answer be for that? Why or why not? And what are your views on GM? Now, you can see I'm fairly sympathetic to GM crops. What are your views, and how would you defend those to people in your church? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'll let those who have power over these things split us into groups, and I'll put those questions into a chat line for you. Maria, we're back up again, I think. Thank you. So the whole question of, we're going to come towards stem cells and embryo research. In vitro fertilization is the process by which, let me just get my pointer right a minute. Egg and sperm are fertilized, are combined outside of the human body. So as to make this zygote, the early embryo that is then grown in the laboratory as it goes from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 cells, and then implanted. Very powerful technique used for those who have difficulty in conceiving. Of course, there are questions that raises. There are always more embryos generated than are implanted. So what do we do with the unused embryos? Well, they're stored, but for how long are they stored? And I think the law says that 10 years, and then what? Well, they could be disposed of. You can get some things with strange generations where the embryo can be implanted not into the woman who donated that in the first place, but to her daughter or even granddaughter in theory. So you get missing generations. So the healthy ones so they're implanted. At that point, if there's a known genetic disease that the either parent could be carrying, you could then test at this stage. You can remove one cell from this small bundle of cells, test that to see does it contain the unhealthy, the diseased gene. Of course, if it is, then you discard that embryo. You've discriminated against it. And if it's healthy, then everything's fine and you implant that embryo. Of course, that still raises the question of there are then embryos that are discarded. And that addresses the question is, what is an embryo? And when does it become a person? And there are a whole variety of different Christian view on this. Does it become a person when the sperm and egg act together? Or is it implantation? Or is it some later stage after implantation? Those early embryos lack any recognizable structure. They do just look like a bundle of cells. And actually 50% of normal fertilizations don't implant anyway and are simply flushed out. That embryo at this stage could divide and become more than one person. That's how identical twins arise. So there are all kinds of mixed arguments as to how we should treat an embryo, as to whether it is a person or not. A conundrum that people have suggested is you may have a freezer full of embryos that are being stored ready for implantation. And alongside that freezer, you have a newborn child and there was a fire and you had the choice. Which would you save? The freezer with 100 embryos or the child? And I think most of us wouldn't hesitate. It's the child. There is a difference, if you like, in the value. Once those embryos are spare, the ones that we aren't going to use, what you do with them? Well, they can be used then for research. In fact, it's illegal to generate embryos just for research. It is the spare embryos that are used for any research purposes. And you might say then, well, is it ethical not to use them? At least there is some benefit coming from those embryos rather than just being discarded. There's a kind of redemption within that. So there are different views on the status of the early embryo. Is it a human person? In which case destroying an embryo, whether for research or just to discard it, it is seen in the same light as abortion. And it's opposed by those with equal vigor, like some of the pro-life lobby. You might say that the early embryo is not a human person, but at least it has the potential to become one. And is there a difference between the pre and the post-implantation embryo? From my view, once it's implanted, and it's certainly once any form of structure starts to develop, there's the 14-day rule in terms of research on embryos. It says you can't do anything beyond that. And that's when some form of structures start to develop within that. Or so some people will say the early embryo is just a clump of cells. And there is no simple single Christian view to that. You can get across the spectrum from evangelical to liberal to Catholic to all sorts of people have different views on that. Whatever you come to, know why you come to it. There's a question too of these things called three-parent babies. The mitochondria have their own small genomes. They're the energy factories within every cell. Their DNA accounts for a tiny fraction of the total genetic amount in the cell. And there are mitochondrial diseases where their genomes, those small genomes, have errors in them. And they can cause some very debilitating illnesses. So it's possible to take the nucleus, so that contains most of the genes, those 99.8% from a person, and transplant that into another embryo which has healthy mitochondria. And there are various views on that. It means in one form of the technology, you do lose one of the fertilized eggs in order to be able to do that. It then is actually heritable once you've transferred that into a cell with healthy mitochondria, of course, that will then be passed on to future generations. There's a question raised about stem cells. Stem cells are very special cells. They're unspecialized cells that can divide and self-renew. Most of the cells in our body have a limited number of divisions that they can do. It's something called the Hayflick limit. They only divide 40 times, and that's it. But stem cells, all tissues have within them a small population of stem cells that allow for renewal, for repair and replacement of diseased or damaged tissues. And that's normal processes. If we can take those stem cells and use them for therapy, can we do that? Well, actually, isolating stem cells from adults is very difficult, and actually they have limited capacity because a liver stem cell only makes liver cells, and a neuronal stem cell only makes neurons. But the early embryo, of course, has multiple capacities. So this inner cell mass, as the early embryo is formed, these are what's called pluripotent cells. It may just look like a mass of cells, and all of those do have the same properties. But as that then divides and goes on to make the whole organism, so these specialize, making heart cells and liver cells and kidney cells and brain cells, etc., where different genes are switched on in each one of those. So where do these stem cells come from? Well, they come from embryos again, and most of those have been derived, their cell lines derived from embryos that were surplus to in vitro fertilization. So there are questions over not the use of stem cells, but the origin of stem cells. And again, that will depend on your view of the early embryo as to how human it is. Is it a person or not? I want to move to some of, if you like, what in the moment is almost a bit like science fiction, but it won't be for very long, is that what do we do about genetic diseases? There are, we know, something like between 4,000 and 6,000 diagnosed genetic disorders. And the statistics are about 1 in 25 children born are affected by some form of a genetic disorder. Some are minor inconveniences, and some have life-changing consequences. And they say about 30,000 babies and children are newly diagnosed each year. Some of those are apparent at birth, and others are diagnosed at various stages. In fact, some of them don't manifest till later. And here's just a list of a few of them that you may have come across, from cystic fibrosis to hemophilia to Huntington's disease, which of course only manifests in the 30s and 40-year-olds. Muscular dystrophy, sickle cell anemia, thalassemia, Tay-Sachs disease, I've already mentioned. Down syndrome, which is a repeat of one of the chromosomes. There's 3 copies of it instead of 2. All of these are genetic diseases. Wouldn't it be nice if we could not have those? Let's look at just a few of them. How did they arise? Some of them are just simple, one change in one letter throughout the whole of those 3 billion letters in the human genome. So here's sickle cell disease, the gene for one of the hemoglobin proteins. One change of a letter from a T to an A amongst those 3 billion causes a change in an amino acid that it mutates and then is sickle cell disease. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to turn that back again? Some genetic diseases, some cancers arise because of mutations, either a mutation such as the one we've just seen, or bits of one chromosome fall off and are attached to a different chromosome and it gets rearranged so it's in the wrong place and is controlled in the wrong way. Some diseases happen because there's an expansion of some regions that somehow distort the DNA structure and properties. Huntington's disease is an expansion of a region that has CAG, repeated CAG, CAG, CAG. And when that gets beyond a certain size, that is Huntington's disease. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to cure that? Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis is a form of motor neuron disease, is another repeat disease. Wouldn't it be nice if we could somehow stop those? can we edit the genome? So, if you like, the genomic equivalent of cut and paste that you're used to with word processing packages, molecular scissors. And probably 10 or more years ago, two of these were developed, called talons and zinc finger nucleases. And then more recently, this whole thing, CRISPR-Cas9, for which the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded this last year. Never mind about what CRISPR stands for. It's a very powerful technology for enabling people to be able to precisely engineer a portion of the genome. And I don't think it's hype. Here's a book by John Parrington called Redesigning Life. And his comment on that is that every once in a while, a scientific discovery is made whose impact on society is likely to be so immense that even abundance of superlatives may not do it full justice. Genome editing looks set to be such a discovery. So we can go in and modify a genome very precisely. It's a technique that is regularly used in laboratories now for research. What about doing that for people? Doing it on whole people is less of an ethical question. And here's a very moving example of this girl, Layla Richards, was in the terminal stages of a form of leukemia. All treatments had failed. Some of her blood cells were taken, modified in this way outside of her body, and then we won't go into the details of how it was done, and then put back again. And she was, from being at death's door, was under remission. I assume that she still is. This was from 5 years ago and more. That, of course, is that one individual. And usually the genome modification is possible on an individual, because if you've got a disease in a liver, you've got to modify all the liver cells in order to be able to get the remission from that. So that's what, if you like, is called somatic cell mutations. So this is, if you like, in the developed organism. So if you change things, you only change them in that individual. It can't be passed on to their offspring, and it can occur in all sorts of genes. And it has been used to say there was that there, which is the CAR T technology. It has been used in a few individuals for treating, I think, hemophilia and thalassemia and sickle cell disease. That's, if you like, less of an ethical question than germ cell mutations. Doing that modification in the gametes, in the early embryo itself. And of course, that doesn't just affect that individual person. That will then be transferred onto all their progeny. It's permanently in the gene line. Scientists throughout the world have said it should not be done. At least it shouldn't be done until we're that much more confident about what we're doing. Now, you may recall back in November 2018, how this Chinese scientist, He Zhuangcui, made the first gene-edited babies. At least he claimed he had done so. The birth of two girls, Lula and Nana, that he had genetically modified as embryos. I have to say that, as far as I'm aware, that has still not been published in the scientific peer-reviewed journal, and he is actually in jail because there's nothing special about China. China has ethical principles as well that people should go through before doing experiments, and he had ignored them. He's been widely denounced by the scientific community for a number of reasons. Firstly, is his genetic modification was unnecessary. It wasn't therapeutic. It was actually to supposedly make the offspring more resistant to HIV infection. It had no ethical approval. There was very limited parental consent when he did that. Some people say he was playing at God. It's the slippery slope towards enhancements and eugenics and making people into a commodity. So people say that that shouldn't be done. But if we got the risks right, if we could be certain of curing an embryo of a genetic disease, should we do it? Is it just a form of embryo healing? We're used to tissue transplants. Is this just a DNA transplant? We need to think about that. After all, again, healing, restoration, feeding of the poor have been part of a Christian's duties. Is it necessary? And actually, the answer in most instances is no, it's not necessary. Because it's certainly for those simple genetic diseases, you could test the early embryo anyway at the 8-cell stage to see does it carry the genetic disease. You'd have to go through that sort of testing anyway if you did any form of genetic modification. So the modification itself in that case is unnecessary. You could do pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to be able to test for it. There are a few occasions when genetic testing can't do it, particularly if there are multiple genetic problems where there may be no healthy, and put the word healthy in inverted commas, embryos to choose from. Francis Collins, again, director of the NIH, strong arguments, he says, against engaging in this activity remain. These include the serious and unquantifiable safety issues, ethical issues presented by altering the germline in a way that affects the next generation without their consent, and a current lack of compelling medical applications. And that's been reiterated by the NIH, by the Wellcome Trust, by the Medical Research Council in this country. Lots of different research bodies have put out statements saying that they're strongly against engaging in human genome modification for the moment. That's not a blanket ban forever and ever, but at the moment we can't be sure about what we're doing. Let me pose some questions, even assuming we could get this right. What sort of genome modification should we do? Should we modify the genome of an embryo that will otherwise die of a genetic disease? In doing that, we're giving life. This is an embryo that would not have been viable, and by changing a small portion of their genome, we're making it viable. I could make an argument for that. Should we modify the genome of an embryo that will, say, have a debilitating disease but still be viable? Something like cystic fibrosis. The life expectancy of those with cystic fibrosis is much greater now than it used to be. It's still reduced compared with somebody who hasn't got that, and it's not pleasant. Should we be able to modify? That's just a simple mutation that we could introduce. Should we modify the genome of an embryo that will develop a disease later on in life? Huntington's disease, for instance. The person may be perfectly healthy until they're in their 30s or 40s and then suffer from a horrible disease. I had a colleague who died of Huntington's disease. What about modifying for one of the genes that gives a risk of breast cancer? A risk, not a certainty. Should we modify that? What about take it to the other extreme, modifying genomes for cosmetic reasons? Maybe to select an embryo with the right eye color, or whose hair wasn't going to go prematurely white as mine did. And what does it say, the fact that we want to get rid of these genetic abnormalities? What does it say about people who are disabled? Tom Shakespeare, who is a great advocate for disabled people and speaks up very powerfully for them, says that people in genetic disabilities are unlikely to be queuing up for genetic modification. Their priority is to combat discrimination and prejudice. And it is them who need to be heard and not prejudiced against. Are we actually implicitly saying that that we'd really rather those people weren't born by stopping others with the same condition from being born? Let me give you a few examples. There's a certain form of deafness that is genetically inherited. And there was a legal case a few years ago for parents who were genetically deaf, wanted to have an embryo selection so that their child would be still deaf like them. And they said this deafness isn't a disability, it's a culture, the deaf culture. The law actually said, no, you cannot select for something lacking an ability. But on the other hand, what's a weakness and what's a strength? We know that the Apostle Paul learned that through God's power was made perfect in weakness. So is it a disability? Is it just a different way of living? Is it a strength, maybe, in a different way? Having said that, Christians maybe shouldn't accept the disease too lightly with maybe a fatalism that sees everything as being God's will. Because what seems like a disease and a weakness for some people actually can include significant strengths and opportunities for others. And if we get too carried away with the possibility of genome editing so as to edit out certain diseases, that raises the question of how society deals with people who are impaired, who have a genetic disability, and that their impairment can't be simply edited away. We are responsible for caring for them, for looking after them. Or some people say we shouldn't edit the human gene line because it's the start of the slippery slope. Once we start to edit for debilitating diseases, what about, is there the risk that we might start to edit for other things to improve? Well, here's the cartoon, perfect pitch, muscle strength, 20/20 vision, intelligence, and so on and so on. Is this the start of the slippery slope to a form of eugenics? Think for a moment with me about life. Life isn't fair, is it? Genetically, it isn't fair. I would love to be a fast marathon runner. I go running most mornings, but I'm pretty useless. And it's because my muscle type is wrong. I'm never going to be a marathon runner. Some people are born with what seems to be a gifting for music or for art. Uh, it's just not fair, is it? Should we try and level the playing field? Should we allow parents to choose to modify the genome of the child that's going to be born? So, if you like, to upgrade the athletic prowess of their children, enhancing their opportunity, giving equal opportunity to everybody so that we're not constrained by our genetic background. It's more complicated even than saying it's like genetic modification or enhancement, because we could do it so we're not introducing new genes, but we're just, if you like, shuffling the pack. We're taking a natural gene that's going to be present in other people and putting it into your embryo, giving them, if you like, a better combination of the genes that are naturally out there. So actually diagnosing whether this ever took place would not be straightforward. If you want a bit of a fun read, I thought reading Peter James's book, Perfect People, was a fascinating bit of science fiction based upon this. The subtitle of this is Be Careful What You Wish For. I'm not going to give you the story of that book, except to say that it was parents who chose, for the best of reasons, to have the genome of their new children modified so as they wouldn't inherit a disease that both parents had. It's got a horrible sting in the tail at the end that I wasn't expecting. It's a brilliant read. It raises a question, what is normal? Human diversity is what it takes to make society. And if you like, gifting is important. We talk, don't we, about an athlete's gift or a musician's gift. And we kind of acknowledge that there is a contingent factor in that. Some people are gifted in that way, others don't. Democratic societies maybe don't like that, that there are some ways in which we just are different, and that we excel in the natural talents and gifts that we've got, that actually we take no credit for ourselves. It's just an uncomfortable fact that some people have different genetic endowments. Life, after all, is a gift and not an achievement. If we did that, would it change the relationship between parents and children? Until recently, the first thing you knew about your child was when the newborn was handed to you. And then you grew to love them and give them loving care and attention, regardless of what their genetic background is. Now that if that technology for being able to choose the genetic composition of a child was implemented, it would turn children into a little bit more of a commodity. The relationship between the parent and the child will be different. Imagine your stroppy teenage children, their response if they learned that they'd been modified or commodified. You did that to me? What? How could you possibly? You've muddled with my genome. But we don't just enhance things with genomic manipulations. We can deal with some of our problems by the use of drugs. And just to spend a couple of minutes thinking about what I call cognitive enhancement. Here are a couple of drugs that were produced for the best of reasons. Ritalin for treating ADHD and modafinil for treating narcolepsy. They're very useful drugs for those clinical conditions. They are, and I don't know what the statistics are in this country, but a large number of students take Ritalin and modafinil in order to enhance their alertness. So it increases their ability to study, to stay up late at night, to do an all-nighter, to cram in the latest information before an examination. So quote some students is modafinil increases my enthusiasm for study. It makes me feel that lazing around is the last thing I would want to do. Boy, would I love that for my students, so they're enthusiastic about studying and they don't want to laze around. Modafinil gives me the motivation I would otherwise lack. Once I've taken a pill, I can stay up all night without stopping. It just works so well, I need it. Wow, it increases their capacity, but it's using a drug in order to be able to do so. Is it cheating? They say that it could make the difference between, say, a 2-1 and a first. And students who don't take them could start to feel coerced into doing so because everybody else is. And as they say, I'm not cheating. Taking a pill is no different than having a cup of coffee. It's just more effective at keeping me awake. I don't think this is cheating, they say. People with bad memory are no different to people who have bad eyesight. You let people with bad eyesight have glasses. Why not let people with a bad memory have pills? What would you say to a student in maybe one of your churches who is tempted to take not an illicit drug of abuse like amphetamines or cocaine or anything like that, but taking something like modafinil or Ritalin in order to be able to, as they think, enhance their ability in exams? Would we want to solve our problems in this way? There are other ways of coping, like exercise or sleep or change of routine or diet or just studying harder. These methods would psychologically alter people because they would be achieving something on the basis of the pills that they took, not necessarily on their inherent ability. It's almost a form of cheating, but it's another form of enhancement and raises an ethical question of what is cheating and what is not cheating. And sometimes actually forgetting is a good thing. There are memories that we would far rather put behind us. As far as the east is from the west, so far as God separated our sins from us and overlooked them and forgotten. Sometimes forgetting is necessary and essential. What about improving people's behavior by genetic engineering? We know that some of our genes do affect us, our emotions, our empathies, whether we're quick-tempered or short-tempered. Could we improve people's morality by genetic engineering? And this is something actually before the present rush of genetic engineering possibilities, the Genetic Virtue Project. And this is taken from that publication. The italics in it are mine, where they say nearly all personality traits show moderate heritability. And the word moderate heritability, moderate's an understatement, it's very moderate. Since genes influence enduring behaviors, it might be possible to use biotechnology in a manner that would promote virtue and thus serve as a means to improve ourselves, morally speaking. Wow, could we genetically engineer people to make them better? Now, we talked about virtue-based ethics right at the beginning, making people virtuous. I think the Christian would say that people are good because they choose to be good, not because they're coerced into being that. That we behave properly because we have chosen to behave properly, not because we're genetically engineered in order to do so. Ultimately, do we run the risk of any form of engineering like that makes a separate species of human beings? After all, they might be faster, brighter, stronger, but would they be better? I rather like this quote I found in the British Medical Journal from Stephen Locke. Many researchers think, he said, that a high IQ goes hand in hand with high moral values. And of course, this correlation is absolute nonsense, as he put it. There is no correlation between morals and IQ. We're just making stronger people, not necessarily better people. I don't know if any of you have seen the film Gattaca, which is, if you like, a science fiction film based on genetic engineering. When it talks about, we've made a genetic underclass of the non-enhanced, and we've made discrimination, as they put it, into a science. Raise the question, would we have made better people or just enhanced humans? Because I think we'd want to say that all human persons have worth and dignity, regardless of what they can or they cannot do. Now, the Christian would say humans have value because of what they are, as made in the image of God, not because of what they can or they cannot do. Its very existence is important. And maybe just in closing, to remind you of the words from the Psalms, which weren't written in order to be able to talk about genetic engineering or about embryos or stem cells or anything like that, but at least to remind us of how wonderful our very bodies are, how awe-inspiring the process from which we go from a single cell into a complex and wonderful person like yourself, where the psalmist acknowledges that God created us in our inmost being, knit us together in our mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Let me, in closing, give you some resources. Christians in Science have produced a number of booklets in Thinking About series. They're available on their website. They're free to download. There are nice printed copies available. I think CIS have them, but you can download the contents of those straight from their website, and they cover many of the issues that I've been talking about today. A few books that you might like. Bioethics for Scientists is written for those studying bioethics, not necessarily for Christians, although John Bryant was a former chair of Christians in Science. Where Science and Ethics Meets gives a few, if you like, real life examples of that. Playing God by Ted Peters, a philosopher, is getting a little old now, but it still raises the same questions. And I put a few websites on there. And just as a taster, coming soon, Alexander Massman and I are releasing the book, Modifying Our Genes, Theology, Science, and Playing God. And that should come out the end of March, all being well. So I'm going to stop sharing now. I suggest that actually, rather than splitting into groups again, we'll just take a general question and answer together. I hope I've raised lots of issues. I think I've probably given you more questions than I've given you answers. But allow you a chance to come back to me, tell me you disagree with me, you've got a different insight on things. I value your thoughts and your opinions as well.